This is an unofficial, non-commercial fan-made story. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or associated with Lucasfilm Limited or the Walt Disney Company. All rights to the original characters, settings, and intellectual property belong to their respective owners. 2,500 years before the rise of the Empire, in a galaxy far beyond the Outer Rim, lay a region unknown and unheard of by the Republic. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, in a forgotten star system shielded from the eyes of the Republic, a dark corruption festers. Here there is no balance. There is no middle class. There are only the elite, who rule from floating glass spires of luxury, and the enslaved millions who bleed beneath them. To the rulers, a slave's life is worthless, fueled by a galaxy consumed by hatred. A teenage gladiator emerges from the shadows, with no family, no allies, and an unknown past. He possesses only one weapon, a volcanic rage. Chapter 1. The blood of the arena. The air on the surface of Onyx Prime tasted like ash, copper, and grease. Down in the pit, the sky didn't exist. There was only the massive rusted iron grating, hundreds of feet overhead, through which the glittering bottoms of the elite's floating glass spires could occasionally be seen through the smog. Up there the high-class drank nectar. Down here, they watched the meat grind. 16-year-old Leo stood in the center of the stadium. Though only a teenager, he stood a towering 6 feet tall, possessing a heavily muscled, athletic build honed by years of brutal survival. His bare, powerful chest was slick with grease, sweat, and someone else's blood. He didn't have a last name. He didn't have a family. The only thing he possessed was an all-consuming, blistering hatred that burned hotter than the smelting factories surrounding the arena. Opposite him stood a massive, four-armed brawler from the lower sectors, wielding a jagged shock cleaver. The crowd of elites, looking down from their shielded, velvet-lined skyboxes safely above the fumes, roared for violence. "Kill him, rat!" A voice echoed through a localized speaker from a luxury box. "I bet 1,000 credits on your head. Don't waste my time." Leo didn't look up. He didn't care about their credits. He hated the beast in front of him, but he hated the people holding the credits infinitely more. The giant lunged, swinging the shock cleaver in a blinding arc. Leo didn't flinch. Despite his massive size, he was incredibly fast, fueled by a strange, cold current that always seemed to hum beneath his skin whenever his rage spiked. He dived beneath the swing, the static electricity of the blade singing the hairs on his neck. In a single fluid motion, Leo didn't just counter, he desecrated. Using his explosive athletic power, he drove his custom vibro shiv, a weapon he had forged himself from, scrapped starship hulls, straight through the giant's lower knee joint. As the brute buckled with a roar of agony, Leo scrambled up the monster's back like an apex predator. He didn't just end it quickly. He wanted them to see. He wanted the elite to watch the horror. Leo grabbed the giant's upper jaw with a vice-like grip, forcing his head back, and drove the shiv repeatedly into the soft flesh beneath the chin. Blood sprayed across Leo's face, hot and thick. He let out a breathless, jagged laugh as the giant collapsed into the dirt, twitching. The arena fell into a momentary, stunned silence before the wealthy spectators erupted into cheers, tossing cheap silver tokens into the mud. Leo didn't pick them up. He wiped the blood from his eyes, staring directly up at the highest glass spire. One day, the voice in his mind whispered, dark and heavy, "I will burn your sky." An hour later, Leo was chained in the damp holding cells beneath the arena. The door hissed open, and the heavy thud of pristine, polished boots echoed against the stone. It was a commander of the Sovereign Guard, his armor so bright and gold it looked ridiculous in the grime of the lower levels. Behind him walked an older man draped in silks, holding a delicate glass of Vexen, the elite's choice of drink. "He's a monster," the aristocrat said, inspecting Leo's imposing, athletic frame through a pair of high-tech macro-focuser spectacles. Perfect for the job. The governor wants the premier of the Western Sector removed before the council vote tomorrow. No fingerprints. The aristocrat turned slightly, reaching his glass backward without looking. The young slave girl, panicked by the sudden movement, bumped the glass with the bottle. A single drop of blue wine spilled onto the aristocrat's immaculate silk sleeve. The aristocrat stopped, his face contorted in pure casual disgust. Without a word, he pulled a small silver blaster from his belt, turned, and shot the girl directly in the chest. She dropped to the floor, dead before she hit the stones. Useless trash, the aristocrat muttered, dabbing his sleeve with a silk handkerchief. He turned back to Leo, as if nothing had happened. Well, boy, do we have a deal? Clean up our political mess, and you get a private suite on the secondary level. Real food, better weapons. Leo looked at the dead girl on the floor. He felt no pity for her. Pity was a luxury for the dead. Instead, the sight of the casual murder filled his veins with an intoxicating freezing power. The cold hum beneath his skin vibrated violently. A dark, twisted smile crept onto Leo's blood-stained face. He looked into the aristocrat's eyes, hiding the monster that had just awakened inside him. The private chambers of Councilman Vane sat at the very apex of the primary floating spire, high above the ash clouds of Onyx Prime. Down below, the worker sectors were nothing but a dull orange glow in the smog. Up here, the air was heavily filtered, smelling of synthetic rain and expensive perfumes. Leo stood near the grand, transparent viewpoint, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore a clean, dark tunic provided by his new handlers, a stark contrast to the blood-stained rags of the pit, but his posture remained that of a predator ready to strike. On a low table in the center of the room sat a shimmering crystal decanter filled with glowing blue spatchka. Councilman Vane leaned back in a carved, levitating chair, swirling a chalice of the cold, bubbling liquid. He looked at Leo with a mixture of amusement and clinical appraisal. The arena was a spectacular display, boy, Vane said, his voice dripping with casual arrogance. But swinging a vibro shiv in the mud is loud, messy. The High Council requires a different kind of precision. Leo didn't blink. You didn't bring me up to the spires to compliment my footwork. Who do you want dead? Vane laughed, taking a slow sip of his spatchka. Straight to the point. I like that. The governor wants the premier of the Western Sector removed before the council vote tomorrow. No fingerprints. Vane set his chalice down with a soft click against the crystal table. The security will be tight, handled entirely by his personal security droids. I want him removed before the morning shift begins. If the public thinks it was an industrial accident, all the better. Leo stared at the councilman, his volcanic rage humming silently beneath his skin. These elites spoke of murder as if they were adjusting a corporate ledger. They thought they owned him, just because they gave him a room with a view and clean clothes. They had no idea that every contract they handed him was just another step up. Consider it done, Leo said, his voice flat. Vane smiled, raising his chalice in a mock toast. Excellent. Succeed, and the first seal of the archives will be broken for you. You can spend your nights chasing ghosts and universal powers all you like. Fail, and you go right back into the dirt. Leo turned away from the glass viewpoint, a dark, lethal plan already forming in his mind. He didn't care about their registries or their petty politics. He was going to find the source of the vibration in his bones, and once he did, he would be the one holding the glass. Chapter 2. The Fault Line. The Western Sector was not merely a district. It was a sprawling, subterranean labyrinth of decaying infrastructure that breathed with the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a dying beast. Rusted copper piping snaked through the air like the veins of a titan, intertwining with exposed plasma conduits that pulsed with an unstable neon blue light. Towering, monolithic cooling towers loomed overhead, exhaling plumes of caustic, toxic steam that choked the lower atmosphere, turning the sky into a permanent, smog-choked bruise. unlike the pristine, gravity-defying spires of the elite that gleamed in the upper atmosphere. The western sector was the dark, visceral reality of the system, the place where the lifeblood of industry was pumped, refined, and bled dry. It was a cacophony of screeching metal and crushing pressure, a dark, dangerous abyss that served as the perfect sanctuary for a ghost. Leo positioned himself on a high, precarious catwalk that clung to the industrial superstructure, directly overlooking the private, reinforced landing platform reserved for the Western Premier. He wore his new dark tunic, a fabric woven from light-absorbent synthetic fibers that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the oscillating shadows cast by the massive, churning exhaust vents. Below him, the sleek, silver luxury land speeder sat waiting, its repulsor lifts humming with a soft, predatory vibration that rippled through the surrounding floorboards. 2 KX series security droids stood watch, their matte black armor plates catching the harsh rhythmic flashes of the industrial floodlights. They were rigid, efficient sentinels, their mechanical heads rotating with a terrifying, calculated precision as their optical sensors swept the elevated walkways for even the slightest flicker of unauthorized motion. Leo watched them, his 6-foot athletic frame carved into absolute stillness. He was a statue of focus, his mind a crystalline void, meticulously calculating the patrol patterns and blind spots of the droids. He carried no blaster, and he knew a standard vibro shiv would be nothing more than a toothpick against their reinforced duosteel plating. Force was not an option. He had to weaponize the facility itself. He had to make the impending destruction look like a tragic oversight, a mechanical failure, exactly as Vane had demanded. The massive, serrated blast doors of the refinery groaned as they slid open, releasing a fresh wave of heat and chemical stench. Premier Thule emerged, draped in heavy velvet-trimmed robes that trailed carelessly along the greasy, grime-coated grate of the platform. He was flanked by 2 nervous personal assistants, their fingers dancing frantically across glowing datapads as they scrambled to log the day's catastrophic production reports. "I don't care about the worker quotas or their physical limitations," Tull barked, his voice thin and acidic, cutting easily through the low-frequency rumble of the refinery's turbines. "Double the shifts. If those fuel cells aren't loaded and cleared for transit by dawn, the High Council will have my head on a pike. Tell them to work until they drop. I'd rather have corpses in the bay than empty coffers." Leo's volcanic rage flared at the callousness, a fire that threatened to consume his discipline. But he ruthlessly forced it down, channeling that dangerous heat into a sharp freezing point of focus. The strange, cold current that lived beneath his skin began to hum in sympathetic resonance with the heavy machinery surrounding him, attuning his senses to the weight and velocity of every gear and rivet. Directly above the landing platform hung a massive overhead cargo crane, suspended by cables thick as tree trunks. It gripped a 3-ton container of raw hypermatter coolant, a substance so volatile that it was pressurized to levels bordering on critical. Should the seal rupture, the resulting thermal expansion would be enough to liquefy everything within a 50-meter radius. Leo moved. He sprinted silently along the catwalk, his athletic stride devouring the distance in a blur of motion. He reached the manual release console for the crane, a point hidden behind a thick, swirling shroud of sulfur steam. The console was protected by a complex electronic security pad, a barrier designed to stop anyone without the proper clearance. Leo didn't have the luxury of time to slice into the encryption. Instead, he reached out and gripped the heavy steel casing of the manual emergency lever. The metal was scalding, radiating enough heat to blister skin, yet he barely registered the burn. The lever wasn't designed for human hands. It was a reinforced iron slab meant to be operated by a hydraulic loader or a heavy-duty industrial droid. To any ordinary man, it would have been as immovable as the station itself. But Leo wasn't ordinary. With a surge of raw, explosive strength born from his desperation and the cold fire in his veins, he threw his entire weight against the steel. The mechanism shrieked in protest, the rusted gears grinding against one another as the impossible weight finally gave way under the force of his intent. The lever snapped into the full release position, bypassing the electronic fail-safes and physically retracting the locking pins of the crane's primary winch. With a deafening metallic snap that echoed through the refinery like a thunderclap, the magnetic clamps lost power. Above the platform, the 3-ton container of hypermatter coolant was instantly unshackled. It didn't just fall, it plummeted, gravity reclaiming the massive weight with violent speed. Premier Tool looked up, his face paling as the colossal shadow eclipsed the floodlights. He didn't even have time to scream before the 3 tons of pressurized death slammed into the landing platform, obliterating the luxury land speeder and everything beneath it in a concussive shockwave of twisted metal and freezing mist. The blast wave shattered the viewport glass of the surrounding towers and tore the 2 security droids to scrap metal. Leo shielded his eyes as the heat washed over the catwalk, his dark tunic whipping in the violent backdraft. He looked down into the fiery crater. There were no survivors. There was nothing left but burning metal and toxic blue smoke. An industrial accident. Perfect. Chapter 3. The Precaution. Leo did not care about the shifting politics of the High Council. He did not care about who sat in the floating glass spires, or who slaved in the factories below. Good and bad were meaningless concepts invented by the weak to justify their placement in the dirt. Leo cared only about the climb. He understood that the only true currency in the galaxy was power, and he intended to collect every credit of it. By the age of 18, Leo's lethal efficiency had earned him a permanent place outside the fighting pits. He was no longer a gladiator. He was the High Council's premier asset. It was Councilman Vane who summoned him to the high spires for his most prestigious assignment yet. A holographic map hovered between them, displaying a distant star system completely separate from their own. "The planet is called Solaria," Vani said, swirling a chalice of glowing blue spatchka. "It is ruled by an ancient royal family. Truthfully, they are not a threat to us. They have no grand military, and their borders are far from ours. But they are becoming entirely too popular. Their philosophy of fair commerce is beginning to spread to neighboring sectors. The High Council wants to take precautions before they have the potential to expand." Leo looked at the glowing blue projection of the royal palace. "You want a message sent." "I want the bloodline erased," Vani corrected coldly. "Completely. It must look like an internal uprising. If you succeed, the High Council will grant you what you've been demanding, access to our oldest archives." Leo didn't hesitate. "Consider it done." The mission required a level of patience Leo had never practiced in the arena, but his ambition was absolute. Traveling to Solaria, he used his skills to enlist in the Royal Guard Academy under a false identity. For 6 grueling months, he wore the uniform of a guard in training. He learned the palace shift rotations, memorized the security blind spots, and slowly smuggled highly volatile hypermatter explosives into the deep maintenance tunnels beneath the structural foundations. One afternoon, just weeks before the planned strike, Leo stood watch on an elevated balcony overlooking the inner palace courtyard. Below, the royal family was gathered. He watched the king and queen laughing, completely unaware of the monster standing above them. Nearby, their 2 young children were playing with a mechanical toy droid, their laughter echoing off the white stone walls. Leo stared down at the children. He felt no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. To him, they weren't children. They were just targets on a ledger. They were obstacles standing between him and the High Council's archives. That night, Leo slipped into the lower levels of the palace for the final time. He wired the hypermatter charges to a centralized detonator, stepped out of the service gates, and boarded a cloaked transport waiting in the shadows of the lower atmosphere. As the ship cleared the planet's orbit, Leo pressed the ignition. The white stone palace did not just burn. It vanished. The hypermatter explosion ripped through the mountain, reducing the royal lineage and their entire court to ash in a fraction of a second. The galaxy would blame local rebels, just as Vane wanted. Leo didn't care about the blame. He turned his back on the burning planet, his mind already fixed on the archives awaiting him back home. Chapter 4. The Vault of Shadows. The High Council kept their word. Upon his return to Onyx Prime, Leo was granted entry into the deepest vaults beneath the primary spire. They believed they were simply paying a lethal asset for a successful job. For Leo, it was the next logical step to elevate his position. The archives were a tomb of cold stone, humming databanks, and flickering light terminals. For days, Leo sat in the dim shadows of the vault, his mind consumed by a feverish, relentless curiosity. He ignored the standard commerce logs, the trade agreements, and the local histories. None of it mattered to each. He wasn't looking for wealth or tactical advantage. He was hunting for the truth of his own existence. He wanted to understand the cold, volcanic current that pulsed through his body, a power that felt as old as the stars themselves. He spent hours scrolling through forbidden texts and fragmented myths, his eyes wide with a hunger for the ancient secrets of the universe. Every piece of data he uncovered only fueled his obsession, driving him deeper into the digital abyss in search of something that could explain the vibration in his bones. His fingers suddenly froze over a heavily encrypted data file buried deep within the system's foundational code, a file that had been untouched for thousands of years. Unlike the standard charts that mapped their known sector, these coordinates pointed far past the uncharted borders of their galaxy. The terminal screen flickered as it bypassed the ancient security blocks, finally revealing a single, isolated world completely scrubbed from public memory. The file contained a single name, Calum Voss. The moment Leo stared at the text, the strange, cold current beneath his skin erupted into a violent, freezing hum. His volcanic rage, usually hot and chaotic, suddenly aligned with a dark, magnetic pull originating from those exact coordinates. He could feel it vibrating through his very bones, a powerful attraction to something out in the deep vacuum of space that he did not yet understand, but recognized as his next target. Leo closed the file and downloaded the encrypted coordinates into a private datapad. The 18-year-old was already preparing to leave their world behind to seek out whatever massive source of power was waiting for him out in the dark. But he needed a flawless cover. He couldn't just vanish. He needed a plan that used the High Council's own resources to fund and hide his expedition. He spent the next few hours cross-referencing the secret coordinates of Calum Voss with the High Council's official active hit list. He cleverly began selecting targets that lined up perfectly along the closest borders on the edge of their known space. The travel to that remote sector would be long and far, spanning months upon months across uncharted hyperlanes. With his list finalized, Leo requested an emergency audience with the High Council in their grand chambers. "You want to wipe out the entire Eastern Edge underground network?" Councilman Vane asked, looking up from his datapad in disbelief. "There are over a dozen high-profile targets scattered across completely isolated sectors. Tracking them all down and eliminating them would take years." "Give me 1 year," Leo stated flatly, his voice echoing with absolute confidence against the glass walls. The council members looked at each other, whispering in hushed tones. Leo stood perfectly still, his 6-foot athletic frame exuding an intense aura of control. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was their number one asset, and he knew they couldn't resist the temptation of completely securing their borders. Completing the entire list in 12 months would be unremarkably hard, even for a talent of his caliber. The relentless hunting, the constant hyperspace jumps, and the sheer physical toll would push his athletic body to its absolute limits. But 1 year was the longest amount of time he knew they would allow him to be away without growing suspicious. More importantly, he knew he couldn't perform the impossible task of finishing all those targets and traveling to the deep depths, far beyond the known systems in anything under a year. He needed every single day of that timeline to reach Calum Voss. Vane leaned forward, studying the teenager's unblinking eyes. 1 year. If you fail to report back by the next celestial alignment, your status is revoked, and you will be hunted as a deserter. "I won't fail," Leo replied, a dark, hidden meaning behind his words. The High Council authorized the mission, granting him a long-range, top-tier scout ship packed with fuel cells, rations, and advanced weaponry. As Leo walked down the boarding ramp into his new vessel, the cold current beneath his skin pulsed with a fierce, anticipatory rhythm. The High Council believed they were sending their favorite hound to clean up their borders. They had no idea they had just handed him the keys, the time, and the perfect excuse to cross the edge of the galaxy. Chapter 5. The feeding storm's 7 months had bled into a seamless, exhausting blur of hyperspace flashburns, frozen atmospheres, and the sharp smell of ozone. The stellar calendar on the main dashboard read day 210 since he had left Onyx Prime. But to Leo, time had lost all meaning. There were no days or nights out on the fringe. There was only the hunt, and there was the drive. Deep within the uncharted, lawless fringes of the eastern edge, Leo sat motionless in the pilot's chair of his scout ship. The main tactical terminal flickered with 26 crimson strike-throughs, each one representing a life he had snuffed out. The High Council had originally estimated there were only 12 major threats in this entire expanse of space. They believed their borders were simple, but Leo had dug deeper into their encrypted data networks, uncovering hidden cells, shadow financiers, and rogue military operatives that the aristocrats in their floating spires didn't even know existed. He had hunted every single one of them down across toxic marsh worlds, abandoned mining moons, and crowded space stations. He had to be flawless. Any slip, any surviving witness who could transmit a warning, or any delayed progress report back to Councilman Vane, would shatter his carefully calculated timeline. He couldn't afford to let the High Council grow suspicious of his location. To maintain his cover, he had pushed himself into a state of hyper-efficiency, tracking targets across multiple star systems simultaneously, always arriving before they even knew their comrades had fallen. Because of this brutal pace, he had not slept in weeks. By all medical definitions, an 18-year-old human body should have collapsed from sheer cardiovascular exhaustion months ago. His muscles should have atrophied from the lack of rest, and his athletic reaction time should have slowed to a sluggish crawl. Yet, as Leo leaned forward to inspect his reflection in the dark viewport glass, his frame looked tighter and more lethal than it ever had in the gladiator pits. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed by deep, hollow shadows of permanent insomnia, but his pupils were wide, electrical, and intensely sharp. Something was sustaining him. Whenever the crushing weight of physical fatigue threatened to pull his eyelids shut, that strange, cold current beneath his skin would violently surge. It wasn't like the temporary, jittery rush of a chemical stimulant or a medical adrenaline patch that would eventually leave his body crashing. It was an external, bottomless reservoir of volcanic energy that fed directly on his ambition and his focused hatred. The moment his mind wavered, the cold power would snap his focus back into place, keeping his heart pumping at a steady, aggressive rhythm, his reflexes lightning fast, and his mind perfectly clear. He didn't understand the cosmic nature of what it was, but he liked it. He craved the freezing power of it. It made him feel entirely disconnected from the fragile, weak laborers he had left behind in the dirt of the capital world. It proved to him that he was fundamentally different from the people who were born to serve. He wasn't just surviving the grueling journey. He was thriving on the lack of sleep, letting the invisible darkness feed his body. The ship's proximity alarm suddenly chimed, breaking the heavy, mechanical silence of the cockpit. The hyperdrive computer let out a low, descending whine as it began its automated deceleration sequence, the stars outside beginning to warp back into focus. Approaching final calculated coordinates, the ship's automated nav computer droned, its flat electronic voice echoing off the metal walls. Caution, unmapped spatial anomalies detected, comm cloning disabled, primary navigation sensors failing to calibrate. Leo gripped the manual flight controls, tensing as the swirling blue and white tunnel of hyperspace abruptly snapped, reverting into the pitch-black void of real space. Directly ahead of him, the stars completely vanished. The ship had dropped out at the absolute edge of the known galaxy, staring into a terrifying colossal wall of dark purple and crimson nebula storms that stretched across the entire horizon. Cosmic lightning, thick as starship hulls, arced violently across the roiling clouds of ionized gas. The massive gravitational shears generated by the storm made the scout ship's durasteel framework groan and rattle under the sudden pressure. Hidden somewhere deep inside that violent, swirling maelstrom lay the coordinates for Calum Vos. Leo gripped the shaking manual flight controls, his knuckles turning white as he plunged the scout ship directly into the roiling wall of the Crimson Nebula. The vessel immediately violently shuddered, caught in a massive gravitational undertow that the ship's sensors hadn't even registered. It wasn't just a nebula storm. At the absolute center of the swirling gas clouds lay a collapsing star, a microscopic, localized black hole. The light from his dashboard began to warp, bending into stretched, unnatural lines of neon color. The ship's engines screamed in protest as the extreme gravitational shear pulled the vessel toward the event horizon. The hull groaned, rivets popping as the metal frame twisted under the crushing physics of the void. Sirens wailed in a deafening, chaotic chorus, and the navigation computer completely fried, blowing out in a shower of sparks that rained down onto Leo's lap. He flying into a cosmic death trap, entirely out of his depth. But then, the freezing current beneath his skin did not just surge, it expanded outside of him. The volcanic hatred that had sustained his body for months suddenly bloomed into a hyper-awareness of the space around him. The cockpit fell completely silent in his mind, the screaming alarms fading into a distant echo. He did not hear a voice. There were no words or whispers inside his skull. Instead, it was an absolute physical feeling. A profound, heavy instinct took hold of his muscles, pulling his hands across the controls with a magnetic certainty. He felt exactly what angle to take. He felt exactly what direction to steer. The guidance was absolute. It was completely flawless. Leo didn't hesitate or question the feeling. He allowed his athletic reflexes to take over, executing the precise movements with micromillimeter accuracy. He threw the ship into a dangerous, inverted dive, skimming the very edge of the gravitational well, using the black hole's own immense crushing force to slingshot his vessel forward. The ship groaned one final time, the hyperdrive engines roaring as they sucked in the compressed cosmic energy of the event horizon. With a violent, bone-rattling snap, the scout ship broke free, launched forward at an impossible speed. The dark purple clouds vanished. The crushing gravity snapped back to normal. Leo gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs as the ship drifted into real space. He wiped a streak of sweat and blood from his forehead, looking out the main viewport. He had emerged on the other side of the anomaly, completely rewritten onto a new plane of existence. Ahead of him lay an entirely unknown sector of space, dense and crowded with a massive cluster of foreign planets, glowing rings and dozens of jagged moons. The stars here burned with a cold, pale light he had never seen from the spires of Onyx Prime. Leo pulled up his private datapad to check the stolen map, but his dark smile quickly faded. The ancient coordinates had been corrupted by the black hole's intense magnetic field. The holographic display glitched, showing a wide, inconclusive red circle that encompassed the entire unknown system rather than a single destination. Leo stared out at the overwhelming cluster of foreign planets and jagged moons, his corrupted datapad offering nothing but a glitched, useless red circle. The mechanical scanners were dead. The navigation computer was melted scrap. But Leo did not panic. He had already learned that his physical senses were the least powerful tools at his disposal. He slid back into the pilot's chair, crossed his arms, and closed his eyes. Instead of looking with his eyes, he looked with that freezing current beneath his skin. He let his awareness expand out past the hull of the dead ship, reaching into the void. Immediately, the magnetic pull flared. A distinct, invisible tether hooked onto his chest and began drawing him toward a specific trajectory. He opened his eyes, gripped the manual thrusters, and followed the feeling. The ship broke through a thick, misty atmosphere and entered a world of lush green, vast oceans, and vibrant, untamed wilderness. Leo landed the scout ship in a clearing, shrouded by colossal, ancient trees. The moment the boarding ramp hissed open, a heavy wave of energy washed over him. It was completely unfamiliar to him, dense, warm, and pulsing with a radiant life that felt the exact opposite of the cold, volcanic rage he was used to. It made the hairs on his arms stand up. Drawn by the thick current of energy, Leo navigated through the dense jungle until he reached the yawning mouth of an overgrown cavern. He stepped into the darkness, his heavy boots crunching on the stone. Deep within the cave, the ambient light of the jungle faded, replaced by a soft, natural bioluminescence. There, nestled in the center of the cavern, sat an ancient, pristine stone shrine. Resting on top of the shrine was a metallic cylinder, a hilt of some sort. Leo approached it, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. The metal was smooth, elegantly crafted, and felt strangely warm when his hand closed around it. He turned the weapon over in his palm. Engraved into the casing in a neat flowing script was a single name, Arya. His thumb found a small activation button on the side of the casing. He pressed it. With a fierce, snapping hiss, a brilliant turquoise-colored laser shot out of the emitter, forming a humming sword with a turquoise blade. The vibrant light cast long, bright shadows against the cave walls. Leo stared at it, fascinated by the raw, crackling plasma of the weapon. But the moment his grip tightened, the cavern air violently shifted. The volcanic rage that lived inside Leo, the hatred for his masters, the ambition to rise, and the darkness that had kept him awake for months, flooded from his hands straight into the hilt. The hum of the weapon grew deeper, louder, and violently unstable. Leo watched in fascination as the turquoise blade began to ripple. The light started to change color, cycling rapidly through erratic bursts of orange, magenta, and violet, struggling against his grip. Finally, with a sharp, agonizing hiss, the blade stabilized, ending up in a dark, bleeding crimson red. The warm energy of the cavern recoiled from him, replaced by a freezing, familiar void. Leo deactivated the weapon, the dark red glow vanishing, and slipped the hilt into his tunic. As he turned to leave the shrine, his boots stepped on something soft. He looked down and saw a piece of parchment lying in the dirt, looking like it had accidentally fallen out of an ancient book. He picked it up. It was a list of written instructions titled, "Force, Jump." Leo scanned the text. The paper explained how to harness the unseen energy of the universe, to know it is in you, surrounds you, and guides you. It instructed the reader to let the energy know their intent, using it to launch their physical body through the air with supernatural power. As Leo read the faded words, a sudden realization struck him like a physical blow. This power, this force, was not just a legend. It was the exact current that had been sustaining him through 26 targets, keeping him from collapsing from exhaustion, and guiding his hands through the black hole. He was born with it. A sharp chime echoed from his wristcom, breaking his trance. The countdown timer was flashing. Leo knew he was completely out of time. The 1-year mark set by the High Council was rapidly approaching, and if he didn't return to Onyx Prime immediately, he would be branded a deserter and hunted by the Sovereign Guard.